So greetings, everyone. My name is Tushar Patel. I am from University of Lethbridge. I work as a Canada Research Chair and Associate Dean at the Faculty of Arts and Science. I'm also one of the Canadian Science Policy Center Program Committee member, and I'm really excited to introduce Mr. Iain Stewart today, President of the National Research Council, one of my beloved funding agencies in the country. To have with us and have a few questions and conversations. So with that, Iain, I'd like to ask you very first question, which is very important considering your organization's role in recent time. So to start with, could you give us an overview of what the NRC does to provide support and capacity to government's mandate in times of uncertainty, such as what we have seen recently, and how does NRC support Canada's sustainability overall?
Okay, Tushar, that's a multifaceted question. Maybe we're going to have a chance to come back to some of the elements of that, because your core question is, what does the NRC provide for the country by way of, in a way, resources or capacity in a time of adversity or challenge? And then secondly, what did we do in the pandemic, for instance? And then thirdly, what are we going to do for climate change? So there's a just great question. Great first question to get us warmed up here. So the National Research Council is a national network of labs. We have 24 campuses across the country. Nice. And we have about 2,225 researchers and technical staff, as well as, in addition to that, administrative and internal services. And then secondly, we have a funding program, the Industrial Research Assistance Program. So we are an instrument of the state in that we are a departmental corporation of the federal government, which means we are part of the government and we respond to and support needs, as it were. That being said, our needs that we support are things like advancing knowledge, that's part of our mandate, exploratory research. Secondly, supporting the economy, business economic development, innovation, productivity, huge part of our mandate going back our full 106 years of existence. And then thirdly, we support policy objectives of the government. And I think that's kind of the heart of what you're asking after. Yeah. Okay. And so in that capacity, if you look over our 106-year history, we've been a resource available to the government for needs of the day. We were created in 1916 out of the First World War. The Commonwealth was called upon to bring forth your scientists and technical experts in support of that war effort. In the beginning of the NRC, right from the get-go, the NRC was asked to address problems. And wheat rust in the prairies, malfunctioning kilns in Quebec for bricks. So just very applied problems we were asked to bring science to bear on. As we built our own labs, we built up our capacity and our teams and our facilities, our large-scale facilities. We obviously have more and more capacity over time. You see in the Second World War, the National Research Council leaned into the war effort very directly and was involved in code breaking, nuclear research, aerospace research, airplanes actually. 18 different radars we developed over the course of the war effort and so on. So it's a tool, we're a tool for public needs. After the war, when the vets came home, some of the things we worked on were like the national building codes, establishing housing for the returning vets. In a lot of communities, you'll see those neighborhoods from the 1950s of those little standard houses. There was a push on to house the vets. We developed, actually Dr. Klein developed the electric wheelchair because of vets coming back with mobility issues and so on. Anyway, you can fast forward the tape over our history. I could talk all day, I guess, about our history. But even as recently as 80s and 90s, think about the first space program was part of the National Research Council. The first astronauts were hired as research officers of the National Research Council. The Canada arm started as a project in the NRC. We've had a nation-building, supporting big objectives kind of role for all time. Now, as we get up to the pandemic, maybe we should pause and make sure that I'm still answering the question you want to have answered here.
Yeah, so So this is great. I did not know NRC is 106 years old, and as it turns out, that you have been the backbone for the country to run a lot of supports as we need, but also forward-looking approaches, and that bleeds to the pandemic question. So NRC had talked before to CSPC about pandemic and responses, but that was before pandemic. What can you tell us about how these biomanufacturing facilities that NRC is supporting and some of the other projects that NRC is supporting, so that moving forward, if something like this have to happen,
Right.
we are prepared?
Right. Excellent question. We have a research center, which is the Human Health and Therapeutics Research Center, that specializes in vaccines and therapeutics.
Cool.
That's what that team of roughly 300 people work on. We also have another research center that focuses on medical devices, and then we have another research center that's focused on digital technologies. Lots of capacity across the NRC that we were able to leverage for responding to the pandemic through the labs, and then also through IRAP. So maybe I'll start with IRAP,
Okay.
and then I'll finish with the recent Biologics Manufacturing Center.
Sounds good.
Because IRAP, of course, funds thousands, over 3,000 companies a year in all aspects of the economy. And obviously life sciences, personal protective equipment, medical devices are a steady area where we have specialized expert staff and we support projects in companies. So we have a great network, and our industrial technology advisors who deliver the program are hired from the private sector, so they have great knowledge of who in the private sector is doing what. When the pandemic struck, the very first thing that I felt the system needed from the NRC were our researchers and scientists in our labs and our technical staff's capabilities, equipment and capacity, and then also through IRAP, our knowledge of the market and the players who could be mobilized. If you think about some of the tactics that were used, Industry Canada, I said, Innovation Solutions Canada, that space, they needed people to respond to challenges. So organizing calls against the Innovation Solutions Canada challenges, IRAP played a big role in trying to line up and make sure good companies were applying and assessing the projects. And then we did several challenges directly for PHAC and others, trying to get market-based solutions for problems that we needed to fight the pandemic. So IRAP was huge, just in having that knowledge of the market and having expert staff who knew about who were players. Also, IRAP is like a channel because it's 260 industrial technology advisors at 110 locations across the country. So another thing the government asked us to do was use our funding program network as a way to connect up with companies that were not eligible for the income supports. They were pre-revenue, for instance. And so they asked us, could we use our funding system to provide innovation assistance program support, which we did for thousands of companies that were too small, too early, too startup to be caught by the larger programs the government was running. And we put about $300 million out into the community to sustain small, innovative companies. Who would have thought of that, right? IRAP as an income distribution strategy to help companies survive the hit of all of us moving into pandemic footing with masking and working from home, and the downturn in investment and the downturn in sales opportunities that really hit these companies. IRAP, of course, funded the development of vaccines and therapies. We've worked with companies to get them to clinical trials, to develop their products. A lot of expert work went into that space. The labs, as I mentioned, had capacity. They had technical facilities, technicians, and researchers who could do things. Some of the things ministers asked us to do was set up a lab testing facility. We set it up in about 7 to 10 days. People working nonstop. And we took an atmospheric testing group and we turned that into a mask testing group in our metrology labs. And we tested lots from about 150 million N95 masks being shipped into Canada to ensure that they were actually N95. And not all of them were performing at that level. So that was something the government literally said, could you test our masks for us? And 2 weeks later, we were testing masks, which we did at scale for an extended period. Reagents, PHAC was low on reagents for diagnostics.
I remember that. Yeah.
So we had a relationship with McGill, we had researchers like Luc Masson, we had people who were able to lean into that space and produce reagent at scale. We produced tens of thousands of liters of reagents and buffers as well. So it was kind of a, what can you do for us? Can you solve this problem kind of dynamic? And then one of the bigger problems that we were presented with was, could we take our latent capabilities in Montreal at our Royal Mount facility for HHT, could we scale it up? And could we create an actual manufacturing facility? Our first pass attempt was to create it inside the lab, just within the existing footprint for speed. But what we realized was that we had to actually create it at scale. And the Biologics Manufacturing Center resulted. That building was built in 11 months on budget.
Wow.
And equipped and commissioned and approved by Health Canada as a drug establishment licensed facility. And has completed its engineering runs with Novavax. So it's a fully functioning entity now, which, if you think about, the pandemic started in a way for a lot of us kind of February, March 2020. That was a parking lot. Now it's a approved vaccine facility functioning at scale. And that's only one of its lines. It has this pandemic response capability, but its mandate is actually to be a public platform and to do early developmental work and public good work that's for non-market scale orphan diseases. And so right now the focus, of course, is on the Novavax support, but we have a whole second line where we'll be working with other partners and in fact have other partners in discussion with us. It's a platform, it's an asset for the country, and we're also moving it out of the NRC because it's ultimately going to be a manufacturing facility. We're a research enterprise, so as a manufacturing facility, it should be out in the market and should be business-led. We're still going to keep a relationship. We're going to make sure that the asset remains publicly owned, but the market will be running and market partners will be engaged in the facility. So that's kind of a long-winded response, and I'm sure there's more I could tell you. I didn't even mention our Pandemic Response Challenge program, which had 67 projects all around specific aspects of the pandemic. And our challenge programs are university, SME, government researcher teams working on outcomes. We ran a challenge program over the pandemic in that regard. I'll stop there.
Yeah, so this is amazing. So not only NRC has expert researchers, but also invest in manufacturing facilities, also help Canada move forward with any programs, pandemic preparedness, looking at the future, and those facilities may help getting next generation researcher to actually get the jobs as well. So this is amazing. So moving forward, now that we talked about the pandemic and the other side of the science, could you also tell us more about the programs and initiative NRC launched to support sustainability when it comes to materials for clean fuels programs and how we can help, or how NRC helps Canada to move forward with meeting the greenhouse gases reduction and so on and so forth. So it's another loaded question, but
that's another huge question. That's a very open-ended question. There's many ways that we try to support the government's agenda for a low-carbon economy and also for responding to climate change-induced or weather-induced changes and their impacts on Canadians. So I'll give you a few examples. An area where we've been working for a long time is on crop research. Productivity issues. Can we develop crops that are less dependent on water, so able to withstand drought, heat, as we have more and more hotter temperature days, new pests and problems, because as the climate changes, so do the growing conditions across Canada. And so our lab in Saskatoon, for instance, does a lot of work on crop genetics, trying to develop more robust crops. I see us doing more work in that space, not less. Genetics, combining with digital to continue to speed up our cycle on crop enhancements, even reducing the need for fertilizer. For instance, fertilizers take energy to produce, obviously create issues in the ecosystem and so on. So crop research is an area where we want climate change resistant, I don't know if it's the right language, adaptable crops. We do a lot of monitoring style work and like microplastics in the marine environment, in the aquatic environment. It's an area where we're active in. We're looking at climate change impacts on the built environment. For infrastructure overall, can we use nature-based solutions to limit the impacts of climate change on coasts? Can we use kelps, new strains of marine vegetation to help with managing storm surges and wave action? So there's lots of things happening. I just wanted to give you a flavor of the diversity. Now, on trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're very active with the transportation sector, with aerospace, surface transportation. We're looking at ways that you can lightweight vehicles. We've been trying to take weight out of cars, replacing iron with aluminum for some time. It's been quite successful for us. Composites is an area where we're trying to, again, lightweight components to reduce fuel consumption for kind of existing internal combustion style platforms and vehicles. For aerospace, we've been looking at alternative motive power. We just kitted out one of our planes. It's now an electric plane.
Oh, wow.
And we have our sights set on doing a fuel cell plane demonstration project. So we're looking at ways to lower emissions. In fact, for air, for rail, and marine, all three of them, we have a series of new initiatives in development to try and take carbon out of the motive power. With respect to new materials for energy, which you mentioned in your question, that's a partnership with Natural Resources Canada. It's involved players like the University of Toronto and Xerox. In our new facility, we have a brand new facility in Mississauga. And that Mississauga facility is focused on trying to combine artificial intelligence and robotics for the design of new materials, for things like catalysts, for hydrogen, and for separating out carbon in order to get better performance. Next generation materials in industrial processes for large scale hydrogen and also, trapping CO2. And it's a suite. I don't know if you've been to our facility there.
No.
It's roboticized suites that are computer operated. It's a project that NRCan has had real leadership in. They're also very involved with us in that regard. And so that is both a place at Mississauga, and it's also a challenge program. Again, I've mentioned challenge programs in passing earlier. Challenge programs are about $20 to $40 million over 7 years, where about half the money is for funding our external partners. So universities and their students and their costs can be covered as they work together with us on areas of interest. We set those up in 2018 because we were trying to find ways to break down the barriers. The government labs tend to get left out of funding programs for large-scale activities, and it has the unintended impact of siloizing all the capacity we have in government labs and our universities. It makes it more difficult for them to have a shared project and have shared graduate students and that kind of thing. So we've been working with the granting councils to make sure they keep government labs as part of their community, and they're responding. We have adjunct professors with postdocs and grad students and so on in the government lab system. But we felt we needed a program tool that was explicitly built for government problems that would have a way of funding academic partners to join it. And we run a range of those. We did one for the pandemic, as I mentioned, and we do one here, the clean materials, clean energy materials. But we have about 9, and we're launching 2 more around maybe the last thing I should finish on this question, which is construction. The ministers have mandated us a number of times to work on taking more efficient building code approaches to reduce carbon in the built environment. And now, most recently, in Budget 2022, they funded us to work on low carbon construction materials. and having the building codes as well as federal national master specification for constructing federal buildings require the steel, the concrete, the cladding, all of the materials going in the buildings have specifications which are lower and lower carbon. So we're taking carbon out of the built environment.
Wow.
And so that was a major award in the last budget. And we'll do a challenge program in that space as well to try and mobilize the academic community to work together on this need to take carbon out of the built environment.
Wow. So in summary, what NRC has been doing and supporting is helping out the global community, not just the Canadian community, when it comes to emissions, when it comes to taking the carbon out of the system, or when it comes to developing this drug and stress-resistant plant. So this is amazing. And I was going to come to the question which you already answered, so I'll come to one more question. So in 2022, Honorable Minister Champagne provided some funding. It was about $20 million funding actually to NRC for the this is the development of the Canadian North NRC program. So could you shed more light on that program, if possible?
Yeah, that's our Arctic and Northern Challenge program. It's another one of these challenge programs.
Yeah.
And that program, like the other challenge programs, has thematic areas like housing, transportation, and so on that are of interest to the research communities. But that program had to be put together in a very, very different way. We had, the program director was Keith Chalk, it's now Ann Barker. And the program needs to be very much done with the communities involved.
The northern communities.
Two big objectives in that program. One was that the communities indicate what are the interest areas where they think the application of research and study would make gains that would be of benefit to their communities. And secondly, capacity building. In a way, a lot of academic research collaborations are capacity building because, of course, our university colleagues we're working with have students and postdocs, and the project is part of their training. The research, universities do research in order to train. It's part of the core mandate, as you, as a professor, inherently know. So it's always part of it. But with the challenge program for Arctic and Northern research, we actually want to go beyond that and much more explicitly focus on trying to build local capacity. So that program is this, and Anne is just a wonderful leader in this regard. In her own research practice, she's been working with Indigenous communities on things like performance Arctic clothing, cold weather clothing, where she was doing work where she found out traditional Inuit clothing was far more performing than some of the brands she was testing against. And in fact, now she's intrigued by how to support that community to take advantage of their competitive advantage, as it were, in the traditional clothing. So these are areas where we're trying to learn how to do our challenge programs differently in order to work effectively with the communities that we ultimately hope to be benefiting, but they need to tell us what are the issues, and we need to talk about how they can participate and what capacity building we can do. And it's working well. There's a lot of activity in the Arctic right now. It's a very exciting time. And I think there's lots more opportunity as well.
To do it. And I really like the idea of community-led initiatives and community-led research idea. So this is different than most organization and most program run. So this
absolutely is.
Yeah.
You're,
so this is a great
right.
initiative. This is a great initiative.
Yeah.
So my last question is that you have had a remarkable career. You had moved from various high-profile public sector positions. And for those audiences here, even at the conference, or people who are going to watch this interview, if you want to share your experience in terms of some challenges you may have had or some strengths that you had developed over the time, what would they be?
I grew up in Cole Harbour, Nova Scotia, and Ottawa was a long way away from my frame of reference. And I knew that I wanted to be a public servant, and I couldn't figure out how to get from where I was to where I wanted to go.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's still a challenge in a lot of ways. So I really invite people to look at the co-op programs, because co-op programs provide a way in which you can find yourself inside the bureaucracy, inside the government, and get a first taste of how it thinks, how it functions.
Yeah.
And also, of course, if you do a student co-op program, quite often it's easier for the federal government to then hire you through the program itself. So I would really recommend that. Once you're in the government, I would recommend that you move around a bit. Early in your career, try a few different things anyway, because it'll give you more perspective. The government is, depending how you count it, several 100,000 public servants organized into dozens and dozens of ministries and agencies and departments. And you need to have a bit of a sense of what's happening outside the room you happen to live in the rest of the house. It makes you more effective in building partnerships, in moving ideas forward. So early in your career, move around, try a few different things before you settle down.
Thank you so much. We are very thankful, Iain, for your time, and really appreciate you sitting us with here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.